to our YouTube channel. Please like our videos, and if you get a chance, share them with your colleagues.
Good morning to everybody. This is John Jackson. I'm glad you could make it to our webinar today. Today's webinar is going to be discussing managing delays, and we will be going through about an hour's worth of delay discussion. This is part one of a two-part series. This week we'll be just kind of looking for options where we can, as project planners, can plan for inevitable delays, understanding what delays do, and hope that today's informative. We will also be following up with an email after the conference or after the webinar if you would like to an option to register for the second part of this webinar in June. There is also a handout. There's an area on your panel there where you can download the handout and be. Let me just start right now with a quick introduction of myself. I started out as a construction scheduler, actually entered into this market through software development back in the early 80s, and ended up out in the field doing scheduling actually. And about 10 years into that, I was asked to do my first, put together my first expert witness report, and began doing quite a bit of expert witness over the last 20 years. And really today's session deals with a lot of my lessons learned over those years as a scheduler, as managing scheduling teams, and as an expert witness. I've made a lot of mistakes on my own. I've learned a lot of lessons the hard way. Plus, in the dispute resolution challenges that I have, I see people that just, if they would have only done a few things differently, they could have gotten early resolution to issues and certainly would have been able to resolve and have a better resolution than what they were able to get. So let's get started. If you, as I mentioned, if you have any questions, there should be a question box on your dashboard where you can enter in your questions, and we'll have a time at the end to do that. The first thing I wanted to talk about today is the 6 phases of a project. This is a slide. This slide or this little lesson I learned many years ago at one of the first workshops I went to, and over the years that I've been in this work, this has proven true so many times. And I want to talk about 3 things that I've learned from this. The first lesson, or the first phase of a project, is what I call the love is blind phase. That's the period of the project when maybe you just got award and everyone's just learning to or getting involved and learning the project, getting to know the other parties in the project, process of signing contracts, things like that. Then once the contracts are signed, typically a project goes into the honeymoon phase where everybody's really getting along, trying to work things out. The relationships are the best that they'll ever be. And then you typically enter into a crisis mode where, project gets behind budget, maybe you have some delays, and then the blame phase starts. That's when the letter writing starts and pointing fingers, filing claims. The punish phase is the phase when the project personnel begins to get moved around, or people are quitting or getting fired. And then the last phase is the hallelujah phase of the project. That's when the mayor or the governor comes out and cuts the ribbon and talks about what a great project it was and how we can't wait to do it all over again. But the main thing about this slide that I find so interesting and that I've learned about that's so important is the first thing is that most issues on projects occur during this early phase of the project right here, during the love is blind and the honeymoon phase. I don't know, it's not scientific, but I would guess that out of all of the delays that I manage, we do a lot of, we have over 30 schedulers in our organization that I oversee, and I would guess that about 80% of delays that I've dealt with or had to write analysis for have occurred in this early phase of the project, whether it's differing site conditions mostly occur during this time. Your submittal process reveals a lot of design issues. You start having relationship issues surface during this period. This is the phase of the project that typically has the most issues occur. I'm just checking on my slide. I had a comment that my screen wasn't showing the right slide, and I appreciate you pointing that out. So this phase is also, not only is it the period of the project that has the most issues that surface, it is generally the period of the project that has the least amount of documentation. I can't tell you how many times. In fact, just a few months back, I went to visit a project that was in trouble after about 9 months, and the project executive comes in and is talking about, all the issues with all of his staff. There's 20 or 30 staff members in there, and the executive says, "We're going to start documenting this project." And my thought was, we are 9 months into this project. It's a little late to start your documentation. So this is the period, schedules that don't get approved or whatever, not updated, that's occurring during this period. So it's the most issues to occur. It's the early part of the project is when there's the least amount of documentation in most cases. And the other major part of that early phase project is it is the period of the project where if you were documenting, if you were identifying those issues early, you have the most opportunity to resolve them early, because it's when the relationships are the best and you have a whole project in front of you to correct issues or to address and work through issues. So that's what I find very important about this slide. Let's do a quick poll. I'd like to just kind of find out a little bit about you guys, in this webinar today, and I'd first like to find out. I'd like to find out which one of what is your role in construction? What role best describes your activities in the construction? We'll take just a few seconds here. And we'll go ahead and close that. And we'll share the results of that. So for the most part, we have contractors in here. We have some consultants, some owners, about 20%, and then some developers in the audience. Let's do one more real quick just to find out a little bit more about who we have in here. Let's see how many of you are directly involved in scheduling. Okay, just a couple more minutes. Most of you seem like you are definitely involved in preparing or reviewing schedules. Well, let's talk about risk and the role of schedulers in risk. Risk is one of those things that in a lot of cases we try to avoid it. There is a study that was put out a few years back, a guy named Daniel Kahneman. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he talked about there's two types of risk management in general. One is the fight or flight. That's where things occur and we just react to them. It's a very reactive approach. And then there's the other type of risk management where you train, you prepare or whatever for the risk to come along, and you have a little more logical approach to issues when they surface. And that's why it's important to really have a good risk management in place, a risk management plan. And in this case, what we're going to be talking about is scheduling as part of that. Risk in general, just real quick, it's particularly in the construction, parties typically try to shift that risk from one party to the other. And let me close this out here. The risk shifting business is what occurs where owners typically try to push risk onto the contractors. Contractors typically try to shift the risk down to subcontractors. And part of our presentation today is going to be steps for risk management that will just help you through that process. Instead of always trying to shift it, the key is to manage risk, right? Identify the risk is the first step in a good risk management program. And that's where a good schedule can help you do that. Identify delays. That's part of what we're going to be talking about today. Assessing those risks associated with different issues that come along, and then managing through the process of the different risk components, and then ultimately resolution of that risk. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that today, but I do want to just show you one of the quick things that you can do. This is a simple table that I put together this many, many years ago, but helping clients just work through the risk. What are the components in the contract? Most of these issues over here had to deal with contract components, and to determine, where is the risk based on the contract, either with the architect, owner, contractor, subs, or construction managers. What's happened over the years, the scheduling specifications have really developed and changed and become a lot more specific over the years as the construction industry has driven it, right? Primarily from economics, the technology that's available now with laptops all over the place. Everybody has scheduling options there on a laptop with them. And then the efficiency, the requirement to meet tighter budgets and tighter time constraints. But ultimately, one of the biggest reasons has been the legal application. And when it comes to scheduling, I think it's important to talk about the parts of the contract that aren't really expressed, right? You have scheduling requirements, you have contract requirements that are expressed. We call those expressed obligations in a contract. But there's also another set of obligations we call implied obligations that are just as important, right? They can be not spelled out in the contract, but they're very important. One item is I've given you just three real simple categories for obligations of implied obligations. One is the obligation to inform. One is the obligation to cooperate. And let me give you examples of those. For example, I had a claim probably 25 years ago where an airport was, a new terminal was being added. The owner went out and cleared a large tract of land, cleared houses. There was a gas station there, some retail stores. They cleared all of that land. And then a few years later, they issued a contract for a contractor to come in and start the excavation for the new terminal. When they got out there, the contract said specifically that any removal of unsuitable soils, the disposal and, finding a disposal place, removing it and hauling was all the responsibility of the contractor. And sure enough, because of that gas station that, had some underground tanks that had leaked over periods of years, it was a significant amount of unsuitable materials that needed to be removed. And it was a difficult option to even trying to find a place where they could dispose of all the contaminated soil. So in the claims process, towards the end of the project, there were several items being claimed, and that being one of them. And the owner's position was, hey, the contract says you have to dispose and remove the contaminated soil. Well, during the discovery, memos came out and surfaced that showed the owner knew the material was there, was rather significant, but they chose, instead of informing the contractor or informing the bidders, they chose to just put an exculpatory clause in the contract that said we're not responsible for any of it. And sure enough, the contractor won that claim based on the owner's failure to inform, right? Failure to inform. The other one is the cooperate. You know, I've seen contracts where an owner has a clause that says you have 14 days to respond to an RFI, and the construction manager took that serious. You have an RFI was submitted. Construction manager says, I've got 14 days on the contract, and out of spite, just did not return the RFI for 14 days and lost a claim because of their failure to cooperate. And then a contractor has an obligation to mitigate. If there is a way to resequence work, to recover time with no cost, a contractor has an obligation to mitigate. In other words, if you have a certain sequence that you plan to do the work, and you have a delay in one area, but you could still start in another area that would mitigate a significant part of the damages, then you have an obligation to do it, right? Unless there's going to have money associated with it. And then the owner obviously would be subject to payment for that extra money if they negotiate a good agreement for that. So those are called implied obligations, and it's important to know that in the contract when it comes to scheduling. So let's talk about the scheduling. Most of you said that you review and you manage schedules. I'm going to go through some things that are very important, particularly when you're dealing with and preparing for those delays that are going to occur. The scheduler's role in risk management, right? I tell our scheduling staff when they're on a project, one of the very first things that you want to do is to find out as much as possible about what the value of every day is, the value of time. As schedulers and as schedule reviewers, we're typically looking at, the impacts on time for construction activities, tasks, and the way they're tied together ultimately to get us to a certain date. And so one of the things, you obviously, most contracts have certain amounts of that value identified in liquidated damages, right? How much is that daily rate for liquidated damages? But if I'm representing an owner, I'm probably about 50-50. But if I'm representing an owner, one of the first things I want to know early in the project is, hey, Mr. Contractor, what is your overhead rate? Or even if I'm working for a contractor, preparing a schedule or update, helping a contractor manage their schedule. Our staff, I encourage them, find out what that daily rate is. Let's talk about it so that as things occur, we can kind of get an idea ahead of time of what, these issues are going to possibly cost, right? If a subcontractor doesn't show up and is 3 days late for an activity, it's important for me as a general contractor to let that subcontractor know, hey, that just cost this much money. Because time is one of those resources. It is a valuable resource, but once you lose it, you can't get it back. You can say, well, we'll pick up and we'll resequence and whatever later. Yeah, you could have done that anyway and still brought the schedule back. Once the time is gone, it's gone. So we want to really know the value of time. I encourage people to get that done right away. And then start with the mentality of planning. I like to quote this quote from Victor Hugo. He said, "He who every morning plans the transactions of the day and follows that plan carries the thread through the complexities of the most busy day. But where no plan is laid, where the disposal of time is surrendered merely to the chains and incidents, all things lie together in one chaos." Basically, my paraphrase of that is, if you don't have a good organized plan for your day, you're going to be living chaotically. A lot of times if I'm not keeping up with my to-do list, that's how most of us, take care of what we need to do today. If I've got a great system that I use online, I keep my to-do list. I like the way I can push things out a day, 3 weeks, a week or a month. And if I've gone through that, or if I haven't been managing that, a lot of times at night, I'll remember something at dinner that I should have done, or I'll wake up in the middle of the night and think of some phone call I should have made. And sometimes I'll wake up in the morning thinking, what was that I woke up about last night? And I forgot about it. So that to-do list is very, very important. Otherwise, I can be living my life in chaos. And the idea is that a construction schedule, if it's done right, if you're managing that process right, and even if you're trying to encourage the contractor to put a schedule together, understanding that it is a to-do list that will make everybody's lives a lot easier. We'll be talking about that a little bit more, how to manage that so you can use it like a to-do list. What I do at the end of my day, I close things out, or I'll move it out till tomorrow, or move it out 3 days, or move it out a week. And I go down through and I close mine out at the end of the day. And I know I may be behind. I may have done some things today that are okay to do them tomorrow. I wish I'd have done them today, but couldn't. But in any regard, I may be behind schedule, but I know at the end of the day that I've got everything under control, and I can go about my evening and my sleep peacefully. And that's the idea of a good schedule on a project. You may be behind schedule, a project may be behind schedule, but if you have a good schedule, you at least know how far behind you are, and you at least know that you have options for resolving delays and working through those things. Another key idea, or another key opinion about the schedule, is that it's one tool on a project that includes every project stakeholder's work, or at least it should, right? There should be items in there for owners that review schedule or review submittals. There should be items on there for every subcontractor's work, and certainly the contractor's work. So the key is to define objectives. What do you want to use the schedule for? What are your main objectives in your scheduling program so that you can manage delays appropriately and then choose the right processes to achieve those objectives? One of the things I've worked with contractors over the years and owners is putting good processes in place, and these are some of the things that we're going to talk about today, where it will help you identify issues early and help you resolve issues early. So once you get those objectives defined, then you can choose the right processes to help reach those objectives. One of the first things to understand is the critical path, right? I can't tell you how many times I've been out on projects. I've been driving around with the superintendent, and he's showing me work here, work over there, this crew's doing this over here, and I've asked somebody, hey, what is the critical path? And the superintendent looks at me and says, everything's critical. And I tell him, hey, I agree. I appreciate your urgency. I like the way you are, excited about all this work. But let me tell you, if everything is critical, then nothing is critical. If you're treating every activity with the same intensity, then you're not truly managing your project as you should, right? Using a critical path, right? And so I learned to put this, in fact, I taught at UNLV for a few years in their engineering department, taught scheduling. And this was one of the charts I used to make my students memorize, just so they could explain what the critical path is. And you can see in this chart, right, I have a plumber and electrician that have to get their work done before I can pour a slab on grade. But my plumber only needs 3 days. My electrician needs 5 days. So my plumber, you can see there, has a couple of days of float, right? And so if you're using software like Microsoft Project or P6 or Power Project, those projects run through a mathematical calculation to get you to that point, right? So you can understand it. So in these scheduling tools, you start with day one, right? And if you're going to finish, let's say that's a Monday, and you finish at the end of day on day 5, and then they'll say the start of day 6 you'll start and finish on the end of day in day 10, and then the next activity obviously can go in 11 to 15. This is called a forward pass, and this gives you early dates. For example, my plumber can start on day 6 and finish on day 8. That's the earliest based on his duration, planned duration, and the logic. But then what the software does, it starts working its way backwards. It starts at the end and starts with 15 and says if that's going to finish on 15, then it has to start on day 11, which means my electrician and my plumber have to finish on day 10 in order for my slab on grade to finish on day 11. And then my plumber could start, the latest it could start is day 8 in order to finish on day 10, finish on 8, 9, and 10. And then for my, my electrician, though, has to start on day 6, which means my subgrade has to start on, or has to finish on 5 and start on 1, right? That's called a backward pass. That's where the schedule counts backwards. And then what the software does, it takes those two numbers, the early start or early finish and the late finish, takes the difference of those. Whoops, that actually should be a 2, right? The rest of these are 0. And that's how it mathematically calculates what we could see, right? In that what we could see in looking at our plumber here, you could see that our plumber had 2 days of float. Now it has mathematically calculated 2 days of float. And that's what the software does. And here's how it plays out in the real world. Let's say we had our electrician that had the 5 days. Our plumber only need 2 days, but a change is made to the electrician's work. He's got to relocate something that's in its way. So instead of taking 5 days, he adds an additional 5 days out here at the end, right? This is additional electrical work, right? So my slab on grade gets pushed out a week, right? So what does my plumber do? Well, he knows the slab on grade's getting pushed out. So he knows instead of 3 days now, he's got 8 days. And so he starts managing his float. And here's what's important to know about float. In fact, most of your contracts have a clause that says something like, the total float is not the exclusive property of any of the stakeholders. It's not for the exclusive benefit of anybody. In other words, whoever gets to it gets to use it. So what happens if a plumber knows that slab on grade's not getting poured for another week, typically, they just kind of take their time. They may send the guys over to another part of the project, or they may send their guys over to another project knowing that they've got extra time. And they're managing their float. Just the reality of it is we all manage float. I managed float. I learned it really well when I was in school. My paper was due on Friday, so Thursday night, I'm out of float, right? I had to get my paper done. My wife calls me she says, hey, you procrastinate. I tell her, no, babe, I'm a float manager. I learned to manage float because we all do, right? We look at deadlines and we typically work towards deadlines. So that's what our plumber does. And sure enough, he gets down to the end and he may get to this point and the owner may say, aha, a concurrent delay, right? We'll talk about concurrent delays in our next session, but it's important to know, hey, is this plumber managing float or is it a concurrent delay? But actually, that's how float works. Once an activity is delayed, it impacts the float on all of its predecessors, right? Or all of the concurrent activities, right? So just kind of understanding how float works is an important part of what we do. So ultimately, the critical path is a slush fund manager for your contract time. If you're an owner, right, and you want to make a change, well, it's helpful to know if the item that you're going to change actually has float in it, right? Or are you making a change to an activity that has no float and your change is going to impact the end date? Very important to know. I had a project one time that the owner made changes to the light fixtures at the end. It was a big theater. They were changing the sconces, and so they asked the contractor for a proposal on how much the change in the contractor or how much a change in those sconces would cost. The contractor came back and said, oh, about $10,000. The owner said, well, take it. So the contractor ordered the sconces, but by the time that the sconces were late in getting delivered, but no one really took the time to see how it was going to impact the schedule if the item was on the critical path. Sure enough, it was. It ended up being about a 20-day delay. Well, that contractor's overhead for that period was approximately $10,000 a day. It was a fairly large project. So that $10,000 change order ended up being a $210,000 change order because the contractor came back and asked for the time associated with the delay in that change, right? So understanding that critical path is important. It can give you an opportunity to make changes and know that it has no impact, or you can understand what the impact may be through that process. So, a good scheduler, whether you're reviewing once again or whether you're preparing schedules, one of the key things you want to be able to do is communicate, interpret when people tell you things, being able to take it and understand what the impact is going to be to that schedule, and then translating that information back to the key stakeholders so they can understand impacts as they go along. So let's talk about preparing for the delay, right? So we're going to spend the rest of our time today just preparing for delay and then identifying delays. Part 2, which is going to be next month, we'll talk more about managing delays and resolving those delays. But it's important to understand part of a good risk management program is scheduled delays are going to happen. I've worked on thousands of projects, and I can't remember ever having a project that there weren't some kind of delays at certain levels, and a lot of them very large delays, very significant delays. So since we know they're going to happen, we need to prepare for them, right? So let's talk about some ways you can prepare for them. Number 1, get a plan in place as soon as possible. If you're a contractor, you should have a plan in place, as early as you can. In fact, some contracts will say, hey, before you even start work, at least give us your first 90 days, right? We talked about documentation earlier. You want to get that project started, and you want to get a good plan in place so you can start measuring progress day for day, especially if you've got, significant projects where your overhead's $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 a day, right? You need a good plan in place early so you can begin to see how that, what's going on that project. We'll talk a little bit more how to do that when we talk about updating. 2 simple things that you can do is schedule meetings during baseline preparation. This is probably one of the best ways to get a plan in place as soon as possible. Get people involved in your schedule. Get your subs involved in your schedule if you're a contractor. If you're an owner, a lot of the owners that I work with, I help them add or help them put specifications together. And one of the specifications that I like to add is there's a weekly meeting on the schedule while the baseline schedule is being prepared, right? So we can see that does so many things just by having those meetings. As an owner or as a contractor, by getting the parties in the room and just going through the schedule. If I'm submitting it, I can go through all the issues with the owner. The owner can ask questions. We can talk about it. Everybody's getting along. This is at the beginning of the project. It's a great opportunity to talk about all the different things going on in the schedule. It's a great opportunity to get all the questions answered that an owner may have for the schedule, so that when the schedule gets submitted, it gets approved much easier or accepted much easier. So having those meetings early I can't stress that enough. You'll get a better schedule and you'll get an approved schedule so both parties can work together in accomplishing the goals that you set out in your schedule, and then do that on a monthly basis. If you do that on a monthly basis, it'll help. I threw in a little slide here. I didn't have it on your handout. This is just thought I'd just briefly talk about early completion schedules right quick, because that's an issue we run into a lot in the scheduling world. The contractor says, hey, I was going to finish early. You delayed me. Now I'm finishing late. I'm going to ask you for the extra time, but I'm also going to ask you for, what we were going to finish, or for the time we were going to finish early as well. I'm going to ask you for those damages. So from a baseline preparation, here's a couple of things to consider, whether you're an owner or developer or a contractor, right? If you plan to finish early, Mr. Contractor, you should let the owner know. Because if it does go to a claim at some point, one of the first things that a contractor is going to have to demonstrate is that they plan to finish early. In other words, one of the things that an arbitrator is going to look at is, did you have enough money? Was this an impact to your budget? Well, if you showed a schedule that showed the entire duration, then they're going to assume that you had the budget in your overhead. Not that it can't be overcome, but it's going to be a challenge. And a lot of the contracts are addressing early completions by actually changing milestones with a change order if a contractor submits schedules early. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that today, but if you are planning on finish early, everybody get the plan on early and let the owner know, and then make sure you're hitting the dates. Show that you're able to do that. And that way, if any delays occur, you have to also be able to show that the delays weren't the owner's fault, right? Here is the first thing, another step to do early in the process is establish milestones. I did a whole workshop for one of the state DOTs here in the last few months, and one of the series that we put together was reviewing schedules without having the scheduling software. In this particular case, this agency had no software, right, to really review schedules technically. So I was explaining to them, if you have good contracts, milestones, or good, you don't even have to have them in the contract, but just good milestones. For example, if you're building a house, right, you know the slab is going to be on the critical path. Well, establish that as a milestone. I want to start tracking when this contractor is going to hit this slab date. If you're an executive, you want to know what your project team is planning on doing and how they're going to meet certain dates, right? And you want to know if they're falling behind on those dates. For example, you want to have milestones that are on the critical path. Here's how it works. I call this project creep, and I learned this lesson the hard way, because so many times contractors turn schedules in and the project's falling behind, but yet they're adjusting numbers. It looks something like this. All of a sudden now maybe the slab is being delayed on your building, on your property, because of excavation or whatever. The slab's been pushed out, but when you're getting a schedule in, this end date still showing hadn't changed, right? So what's happening, a contractor is taking days out of the end or resequencing or cutting durations to still show finishing within the contract time, when in reality they're not going to, they're borrowing time from the end to make up for time that they're not. This is very important. I had a project executive, it's been a few years now, but it took me out. He's crying, oh man, my project manager was telling me over and over and over again that we were going to finish on time. We were on time. We're on time. But in reality, they were falling behind. The project manager was just tweaking the schedule, still showing on time. And sure enough, they ended up in this scenario where the owner calls and says, hey, you're not going to, we don't think you have any possible way of finishing this project within the contract. You have about 6 months worth of work left to complete, and you only have 2 months left. And this executive was telling me this story. He says, I called my project manager, and the first words out of my project manager's mouth was, I quit, right? So this stuff happens all the time. So what you can do, you can just do this with a spreadsheet. Take your contractor or your project manager, if you're an executive, take the project schedule, establish some early milestones, and just put it in a spreadsheet. And you can look at it and you can see, hey, the slab slipped, for example, this month, and the end date didn't slip. Well, I can tell right then somebody's messing with activities toward the end, right? Let's setting up those milestone schedules. If you have any questions on that, I've got some nice little tips on that. You can just contact me later. I'll leave you my contact information. You can ask me I can send you a spreadsheet or whatever for that. But it's a very important thing to establish those milestones early and then get some good updating procedures. And like we just talked about, one of the main things is, what does on schedule really mean? What does, I have someone says, oh yeah, we're on schedule. Well, are you telling me that you're still planning on finishing within the contract time? Or are you telling me that last month you said you were going to pour the slab this Friday, and yes, you're still planning the slab this Friday? To me, that's on schedule. If you can't tell me last month what you're going to do this month, then what you're telling me you're going to do over the next 2 years, I don't have a lot of confidence in. So learning that term, what does on schedule mean? When someone says, yes, we're on schedule, what are they saying? Are they talking about the end date, or are they talking about their progress compared to what they planned? So I always make my schedulers, the people that work for me, and all the projects that we have, I get them to put together a little summary of, I want to know, yes, that completion date is important. Are we still finishing within the contract completion time? But I also want to know, hey, last month we said we were going to have the slab poured on Friday. What is that progress on the critical path? How did we do it? Are we still planning on pouring that slab? Oh, we lost a week. We're not pouring it till next week, right? So then I can look at that and the completion date, and I can address questions. And it's a great way, even after the fact, if you have delay analysis, to do. I'm prepared a paper. It's getting published. I'm doing a presentation this summer at a AAC conference, and that's what that paper is going to deal with, is identifying these types of issues and actually doing delay analysis, looking at schedules using this tool. So it's important. On schedule. What is the completion date? What is the progress on the critical path? And then potential problems. I wanted to show you guys something. I've got a product right here that our firm uses to keep track of all of our schedules. It's called Schedule Validator. It's got some really good tools on it, and this allows me to take a look at just what we were talking about. Let me pull this up right quick. Got my webinar deal here. Give me just a second. Let me show you how this works and how you can utilize a tool to. So I have this schedule validator. I can upload my schedules in this. I can upload whether it's a Microsoft P6, Power Project. I can upload schedules, and it'll give me analytics, right? It'll tell me problems I'm having, issues I'm having with the schedule. I need to clean up some constraints, predecessors, successors, more or less a diagnostics tool. It's got that functionality, but I can also upload all of my projects and start getting more sophisticated schedules. I can look at trends. I can look at trends for this project, and I can tell, if a project is, having problems meeting their dates. I can see when project schedules were changed, doing all this kind of stuff. But one report that I wanted to show you, dealing with what we've just been talking about, identifying when a project is falling behind. This is probably my favorite report. This is a project I've got a claim on going right now. But I can look at a couple of these, and I can run this critical path comparison, and this will show me that my end date lost time, and I can really drill down in here and see, when here was a delay activity that shoved the end date out. I don't have to have any software to download or install. I can upload a contractor schedule or upload our own schedules, and I can see, in this case, I can see when projects slipped from my dashboard. I can see when here's projects where the critical path slipped, right? So when I run that filter on projects where the critical path slipped, I can see here's the schedule where the critical path slipped and the end date didn't. So I can tell somebody's playing with that schedule. So those are the kind of tools that you can use out in your schedule reviews to identify issues with schedules, just like we're talking about here. Being able to go in and find out, here is, and this is a little narrative that we put together that says this week the schedule is so many days ahead of schedule, and then here's my critical path. This week we maintained. I teach our schedulers. I either maintained, slipped, or gained time. So you can, once again, you can do this with a spreadsheet. You can use some software like I just told you. But you can do it with a spreadsheet. Go on there and say, hey, if the slab slipped this month and the end date didn't, then the schedule's being manipulated to still show finishing on time. Very important. When you start implementing these kind of things for managing delays, when you start implementing these types of programs and these types of issue identification, accountability just works wonders. I work with so many contractors, or I work with a lot of owners, and they're like, how can we get this contractor to put a good schedule together? We cannot get them to put a good schedule together. And so you can beat them up with contract specs. That's one of the things I learned about specs years ago. You can spec a contract to death, but there's still no way you can put scheduling specifications together that'll guarantee good planning, right? You can make them meet a contract requirement, but you can't really force them to do good planning. But what I have learned over the years, if you start having these little accountability, hey, Mr. Contractor, based on your schedule, you lost 3 days this week. You lost 4 days last month. You're 2 weeks behind based on your schedule, your baseline schedule. That accountability is the best tool that you have to really get a contractor to start planning their work better. And same thing with if you're an executive and you're trying to get your project teams to schedule better. Good accountability works, right? Issue identification. Taking this approach will help you find out, hey, if this slab, I keep using the slab as an example, if it continues to slip, there's obviously issues. It gives me the option to go to the contractor and say, hey, what's going on? Why is that slipping? And unless they have a good owner reason, it's going to be very difficult for them to come back later and shift the blame, right? So, and if there is an issue, if there's, some over exits required or whatever, a lot of times, identifying those issues is one of the best ways to get the resolution process started. Also, in addition to identification of issues, it helps for early resolution and then obviously, ultimately, to avoid delay claims. Once you do that, what did you do? What did you say last week? That last month? What did you do last week, last month, right? These are the kind of the questions that kind of looks at last month. You said you would be here today. And what did you do? Well, you're either here at this point in the schedule or you're not, right? If you take that and then also look at what happened to make up the difference, then you can actually put together a nice little package, a nice little spreadsheet that says this week or this month, this year, the schedule lost this much time, but work was resequenced to gain that time back, right, for a net total. The owner gave, an RFI, design change, delayed it. 2 months later, the owner gave a time extension to bring it back in line, right? And so you can account for every day. I always tell people, accountants, they get called bean counters. A good scheduler, we're called day counters, right? We want to account for every day just to make sure, once again, that accountability will work in making the project go as efficiently and as well documented as possible. Speaking of documentation, one of the other things that you can do in preparation for those delays is have good documentation procedures. One of the best ones you can do is, once again, making sure that your schedules are getting submitted early and regularly. I have been in so many situations where a contractor submits a schedule and maybe it goes months and months without getting approved. So what happens? The contractor doesn't update their schedule. So you have delays that occur, and sure enough, there's no documentation to really go back to really identify or analyze the impacts to the project schedule. So I tell my contractor friends, hey, even if the owner hasn't approved your schedule, you need to go in and update it. Number one reason, most contracts tell you to do it whether its baseline schedule is approved or not, right? Most contracts say you got to turn in an update every month. So use that contract spec, update your schedule every month, and have a good record of what was going on. So establishing good procedures is important. In fact, it is the one thing you can control on the job. Many construction projects, in fact, every construction project I know of, there are so many things that can go on that you have no control over. But I had an attorney that really stressed to me, that's the one thing contractors and owners can do that they have complete control over, is how well they document things. And this same attorney used to say, hey, there's 3 Ds, on resolving disputes: documentation, 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 right? So I can't stress that enough, how important it is that you document. And the schedule, once again, especially when it comes to delays, is one of the best documentation tools you have. Most construction litigation involves dispute over facts and not the law. So most of the time, it's not so much that you can't say we were delayed as a contractor. It's just, I don't have any schedules, or I don't have any way to substantiate whether that delay was on the critical path, or how many days it was, or whether it was even still critical at the time of the delay. So get your facts in place, get your projects documented, and update your schedule. It's as simple as that, right? Maintain a good project record. Keep your projects organized. You have one of my first claims I had to go through. I got boxes and boxes and boxes of documents, and I had to just kind of weed through them. I'm like, what do I even start, right? So I did my research, and I found that most project documents the project record gets divided into 3 types of documents. There's the contract documents, right? That's where most items get documented. The proprietary documents are like daily reports, estimates, budgets, any of your internal, any internal documentation, journals. Then you have your project documentation, which is the anything that's officially transmitted, emails, right, all the way up to letters, RFIs, submittals, anything that's officially part of the correspondence that both parties should have a record of it. And then ultimately your contract documents. That's where everything really begins, right? Putting the contract together, and ultimately that's where the money gets paid, right? And one of the problems people that or conflicts that I get involved with, where teams could not come to resolution, in most cases it's because they didn't have a good process to manage their documentation, right? And so once again, preparing for that delay and managing through those delays, the first order of business is to get your schedules and get good documentation together. And then once again, your field documentation is so important. I call it the Facebook paradigm. I had a friend years ago when Facebook first came out. He would use his Facebook to go out and take pictures of his job and post, ran into a sewer conflict, hit this utility underground. We're going to have to relocate it. Just documented on Facebook, all right? I think he lost most of his friends over that time on Facebook, but he certainly had a good documentation record for his entire project. So there's no excuse, right? There's good, free, cheap tools out there on the market where you can get in there and, document and actually have little news feeds to do that. So that's what I wanted to really cover today, managing delays. Number one, the really important things are going to be getting your schedule in place early. Identify your critical path. Identify some milestones so you can identify issues early. And then begin preparing for that delay by getting a good baseline in progress, get a good update, start updating regularly. And even if you have, once again, if you're an owner, if you have it, or a developer, if you haven't approved the contractor's schedule yet, make them update the schedule, because the contract says to, but it also help them see how they're doing on their schedule, and that accountability will help bring things back. In the next session, we are going to address how delays impact a project. We'll be talking about working overtime and efficiency, productivity issues, how delays impact that. Then we'll be looking at the components of a delay analysis and general categories for delay analysis. We'll spend some time identifying and talking about concurrent delays. That's going to be really important. That we'll be talking about how delays often don't get resolved because sometimes there is a certain amount of concurrency. So how to work through that process so you can get that issue resolved through concurrent delays. And then we'll be talking about doing a real simple claims risk analysis or delay time impact risk analysis to look at, okay, how can we resolve this? What's at risk? And how can we move forward with that? Okay, so that's pretty much it for today. Let me pull up some questions and let's see if we had any questions. If you have any, wow, okay, a lot of questions. Let's see, I'll go through this right quick. Let's see here. I had a question here about what's the difference on a bar chart and a CPM, right? Well, the only difference between a bar chart and a CPM, right, is the logic. A bar chart will have the two components of a time associated with a scope of work and the time associated with it, right? And the critical path method, that would be a good to-do list item, by the way. But what a critical path will allow you to do is actually tie those tasks together, right? So as we looked at, where those relationships will show when one task is impacted, it shows the rest of the issues that get impacted. Let's see here. Any other questions? That looked like there were one question here. How many contractors really follow the schedule? That's a great question, and that's the challenge of the day, is getting a contractor to follow the schedule, right? And once again, that's where your accountability will come in. Most contractors never look at the schedule until the end of the month, unfortunately, right? because that's a task they put off till the end of the month. It's funny, I sent a proposal over to a contractor today, and it's like, oh, that's too much money. We only want to look at the schedule once a month. Now, I felt like saying, well, if you're only looking once a month, then you're not, obviously, there's too many things that can happen to a project in a month to wait for a month to look at the schedule, right? So you can use 3-week look-aheads, whatever. But it is very important to get a contractor to actually look at their schedule and try to work their plan. Obviously, the more they look at their schedule, the better they'll become at planning, right? If you're holding them accountable that they're falling behind, that's, like I said earlier, that's the best way to get them to say, well, I've had contractors walk out of a room, a project manager walk out of a room, call a superintendent and say, if you don't start giving me good days, I'm going to, blah, blah, blah. Went on and on and on, because the accountability was making the project manager look bad because they weren't hitting their dates. So he began to really jump on the superintendent to give him good dates so he didn't have to be held accountable. And sure enough, they ended up starting to plan their work, right? So that's generally how that's how that works. Let's do a couple more here. Does the owner take back the days when a contractor shows their baseline finishing early up front? What risks are there to the owner? Well, here's the challenge, right? If I'm a contractor and I turn in an early completion schedule, generally that's going to require not only me to finish my work early, but it's going to require the owner to finish their work early. For example, if I've got 3 years on a contract and I say I can finish it in 2 years, well, what that really means is the owner is going to have to turn RFIs around, review submittals, all the tasks that an owner has to do, get inspections, all those kind of things. Your contractor puts the owner at risk as well for that. So it's important when you're turning in a contractor turns in an early completion schedule to let that contractor know, hey, that's not how we put the contract on the street, right? Because we know it's going to take certain time. We know there's certain things that are going to happen. So what a lot of owners do, they'll put it in the specs that say, we hope you finish early. You can turn in an early completion schedule, but you can't ask for extended overhead until that contract time is all the way used up, right? Or they'll say we're going to make a change order to change the contract date based on your early completion schedule. And the argument for there is, hey, if we've got from an owner side, we've got 3 years of engineering in our budget, but if you're going to make it 2 years, it's going to take the same amount of engineering on our side. So we're going to squeeze our engineering schedule. And that way, if you don't make that 2 years, you're going to have to start paying our damages after 2 years because we've already used up our budget. Right, so there's different ways to handle that, just depending on the situation. Another question from Krishna: how important is it for the management team to believe in the value of schedules? Well, obviously you're asking a guy that's kind of biased. I'm a scheduler. I think it's very important for the management team. I can tell you the difference on projects where the management team, both sides, contractor and owner, believe in the value of the schedule. They work together. I've been on those projects. They work together, resolve issues together. Next, in the next slide, we'll talk about acceleration, right? And if both teams are working on the schedule, very few schedules, as I mentioned earlier, about 80% of schedules happen early in the job, right? So very few schedules have that occur early, since most of them occur then. Very few schedules, if the teams work together, very few schedules don't have an opportunity in them to make up a lot of the time. In fact, in a lot of cases, you can make up most of the time by working together, looking for concessions that can be made by one part or the other, or minimize the risk, pay a small portion, and actually bring the schedule back instead of waiting till the end and finding, having to pay a whole bunch of general conditions, extra general conditions, when it could have been resolved by addressing it early. So anyway, that's all I'll try to get back to. I'll try to answer the rest of your questions and via the question panel. But that's it. Feel free to contact us next time. You'll get a follow-up email that'll allow you to sign up for part 2, and I hope to see you then. and my contact information is right there. If you guys have any additional questions, you can email me, or certainly feel free to even give me a call. Once again, thanks for showing up today, and I hope that we'll see you next month. Talk to you later.
Thanks for watching. Now don't forget to like our videos and share with your colleagues. Please leave us comments. Thanks for watching. Now don't forget to like our videos and share with your colleagues. Please leave us comments.